She is a child of the civil rights movement, both literally and figuratively. Donzaleigh Abernathy grew up on the front lines of the marches and boycotts that forever changed American history. Her father, the late Dr. David Abernathy, was said to be the architect of the movement, and his best friend, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., its voice. So close were the two men that Donzaleigh Abernathy actually grew up addressing Martin Luther King as uncle. And it was Dr. Abernathy who introduced Dr. King at what was to be his last speech on the eve of his assassination. The co-founder of the Southern Leadership Conference, Abernathy continued to lead the civil rights organization even after King's death. As recent events, both in the United States and abroad, have illustrated, the fight for civil rights seems more crucial than ever. Here to share her memories and the importance of keeping the movement's message alive is Donzaleigh Abernathy. Welcome to Full Frame.
Hi, thank you.
So great to have you on the broadcast. We look now at your father and Dr. Martin Luther King with such reverence, but you were a little kid growing up. I mean, he was probably sitting at your kitchen table. I mean, to me, it's mind-boggling of that childhood. Walk us through it. What was it like?
Well, he was definitely sitting at our kitchen table. Uncle Martin used to eat dinner at least 4 nights a week at my mother's house because my mother was a great cook. She was a better cook than Aunt Coretta, and so Uncle Martin always wanted everything to happen at our house. He knew me before I knew myself. So much was going on, I mean, all the way to the very end, and then after, and then there's the shock that, it was real, and, for me, he was, just Uncle Martin, and then all of a sudden now he's a holiday and a monument and a legend, and it's humbling.
You said till the end, and your father was there with him on when he took his last breath. I mean, in many respects, he was there from start to finish. Mm-hmm. How devastating was it for you, for the family, for your father to go through that? And before I say that, I think, give us a sense, because I think people don't recognize, time has passed. They don't recognize the threats that your father received, the type of life that you had to go through, the difficulties, the enormous difficulties. This was a life and death struggle.
Well, at the very beginning, there was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and then Rosa was arrested, and the reason E.D. Nixon called my dad was my dad had just completed the membership drive, and he was the #2 man at the Montgomery NAACP. Rosa Parks was the secretary, and my dad was going to go work on his doctorate, and Uncle Martin said to my dad, listen, you can use my church. I'm working on my dissertation at the time. And Uncle Martin was basically the reluctant hero. He did not want to really lead a social movement. My dad organized the bus boycott, called the ministers and said, this is what we're going to do. And then 3 days into it, Uncle Martin was chosen as the head, and then my dad took on the position of vice president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. My dad named the organization, and then it was a 381-day bus boycott. And what they would do is the KKK would call our home in the morning and threaten to kill us, and then, kill my mother, my father, and my sister, because I was not born at that point. And then they would call in the evening. A woman would start in the morning, and then a man would call in the evening, and it was just a regular death threat. So when my mother was pregnant with me on January 10th, and my father and Martin Luther King went to Atlanta to create the new Southern Christian Leadership Conference, my mother got up from watching the Jack Parr show. She went into the bedroom, she laid down, and the entire front of the house exploded. And I was in my mother's womb at that point, and so when I was born, I shook. They bombed my parents' home, they bombed my dad's church, they bombed my Bell Street, Mount Olive, and the home of Reverend Robert Gratz. And it was just like sending a message that you might have the right to sit where you want on the bus, but we still control, and they wanted to create fear. And the thing that I think was so special about Daddy and Uncle Martin was they were so courageous, even in the midst of the threat of death. My dad used to say, if we die, then our blood will cry out from the earth for freedom. We had endured 244 years of slavery. We had endured 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. It was time it was time, and so we had to fight, and I'm glad they did. They've made it possible for me to live freely in the world where I live today. They've made it possible for me to come into the front door to this studio today. They've made it possible for me to sit at a restaurant later today and order what I want and not be a servant. And all of these things changed in my lifetime. And before that, you know, we didn't have those freedoms and those liberties. They were courageous people, and I'm blessed to have been born to them.
For some of our international viewers who might not be familiar, the KKK's, the Ku Klux Klan, which I guess today we'd call them terrorists. I mean, they were terrorizing you and your family and many others. And the Freedom Riders were, and I've had the opportunity to interview some of them, obviously aged now, but many of them young teenage, I mean, the one I interviewed was a young teenage Jewish kid who
Right.
drove down, very courageous.
Very.
It must have been amazing to be around all of this, but you don't, I mean, it's fantastic your father did what he did, but a little girl doesn't buy into this, and the mom doesn't necessarily buy into this. You're kind of dragged along in many ways, or did you? I mean, it's one thing to admire what he did, but your life's being impacted on a daily basis, the entire family. Was there ever a time where, hey, Dad, you know, just take your foot off the gas pedal maybe a little bit, or your mom maybe saying something to him?
Well, you know, my mother is, she's a revolutionary at heart. And I think that's another reason why my father was really attracted to her, because he was very, you know, nonviolent and just calm. And she's got fire. And I guess that's why she's the only person that's still alive from the very beginning. She's got fire. And, you know, Uncle Martin used to come over to the house and he would say, I need to hear what Juanita has to say. What do you think, Juanita? And my mother's opinion mattered. I'll never forget, we were in the Atlanta airport. It was still the days of segregation. And we were, you know, my mother said, let's go to the restaurant upstairs. And it was a segregated restaurant. And so we all went. And we stood up there, and they refused to serve us, and white people kept passing us by, and we just sat there waiting, demanding for the table. And then an hour later, they finally gave us a table, and we sat down, and my mother was like, I'm not pleased. This isn't right, and this isn't right, and they're not treating, because they weren't gonna, no one came over to serve us. And then finally, she decided, okay, we're leaving. And Daddy and Uncle Martin were like, really, Juanita, do we have to go? Do we have to go? We're like, yes, we have to go now. And up we got up and we left. But the point was being made, and my mother was the driving force. My mother decided that we needed to integrate the elementary schools. My mother said to Aunt Coretta, we need to integrate the opera. The Metropolitan Opera used to come to Atlanta, and they wouldn't allow black people to attend or to have season tickets. And my mother said, no, we need to put our foot down. And so my mother was pushing. She was always, you know, after Uncle Martin died, I think my mother wanted my dad to, you know, stop. That she was always afraid that they were going to kill him. I'll never forget that on Monday mornings when we would get ready to go to school, we would sob because he had told us one day, I'm not going to come back in that door. And you know, as a little kid, you know that's traumatic. I thought, you know, I just knew that I would never live to be 16 years of age. I had written my will before I was 16, and we were good kids. We really were good kids. I mean, because the threat of death was so great outside of the home inside of the home was a haven.
There's so many memories. In fact, I'd like to show a picture and take you back. Talk to us. You're in the corner here. You got the striped sweater, right?
That's me, the striped sweater on the front lines, and my brother Ralph III, and my sister Wandlin, who now lives in Germany. My mother, my dad, Uncle Martin, and Aunt Coretta. And that's on the Selma to Montgomery March for the Right to Vote. And we walked on the front lines 2 days, and we marched 16 miles for the right to vote. And they would give us a salt tablet so that we would not have to go to the restroom. And that photograph, my mother has her hand on my back because I'm walking too slowly.
If your father were alive today, and Martin for that matter, where would they see the civil rights movement today? Where would they see the complexion of the United States today? I mean, would they be pleased with some of the successes, disappointed in the areas that still need to be worked on? I mean, how would they view it, and how do you view it?
Well, if they were alive today, they would deeply be concerned, especially with the major legislation, which makes it more difficult for people to vote, as well as they would be marching, but they would be empowering those young people so that they know that they're doing the right thing. Because in Birmingham and in Selma, it was young people. They arrested young children as young as 8 years of age. They turned water hoses and dogs on young people, just like they're doing today. They're not turning the water hoses on them, but they are still gunning them down. So they would be trying to, empower the people in the community and trying to create young leaders.
Is that an area of concern as well? I mean, you're talking about the legislation, but that it's almost as if someone hasn't grabbed the mantle in many respects. I mean,
people
are you
like
looking?
me.
Well, you're there, but I mean, are you looking for younger people to step up and to maybe take more of a lead?
I am, because my generation, we took for granted that we had arrived. We refused to be a voice and continue the struggle. I mean, continue the fight for freedom. And that's where we messed up.
But let me stop you there and ask you the other question that comes to mind. The arriving. You said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in a sense, there's a complacency that sets in. We've arrived. I think, don't you think that here in the United States that it grew even more when, well, we have a black president, everything's okay. And now, while he's president, we're seeing a lot of these issues cropping up. It's not enough that you have a black president and a black attorney general. I mean, I guess that would be again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's what I'm hearing from you in a sense.
It's not enough. I mean, I think the president, a black president, became a lightning rod, and people that had racism that was lying dormant, it reared its ugly head, and they started to express it more, because they were angry that a black man was in the White House. And so now it has become even in vogue to be anti-black, anti-Semitic, and or anti-Latino or anti-Asian, and it's not okay. It's not enough for people of goodwill to sit back and think that someone else is going to fight that fight for you. We each individually have to do something, and we've got to extend that olive branch to our neighbor and say, listen, I need you to come and be a part of my community, and I need to be a part of your community. We need to sit down and break bread together, and we need to figure out how to solve problems together. I'll never forget when President Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, take down that wall. And those Germans joined hands and they sang, We Shall Overcome. And that was the song that we sang during the days of the Civil Rights Movement, and it broke my heart and I just cried. But they were tears of joy. I was so proud and so happy that we had been able to influence another country. And Desmond Tutu told me that it was because of the Civil Rights Movement. It gave them the courage to continue to fight apartheid in South Africa. And when Nelson Mandela got out of jail, he went to Atlanta, and at the reception, my mother walked over, and the first thing he said to my mother is, Juanita, where's Ralph? And my father had just passed. And so it was like, they did something, they started something, and the rest of the world followed. And what they did, I want you to know, was not unique, because all they did was follow Gandhi. And what was so great was that they used the method of nonviolence, which I think was the difference,
Can I ask you one final question before we go? Growing up in the presence of such greatness, which you were around, having Uncle Martin and your father, did it feel as though they cast a long shadow that it's tough to emerge from that? Because I just think the burdens of being a child, growing up around such greatness, what do I do with my life? Did that ever hit you at any point in your lifetime?
It sure did. It absolutely did. And I just didn't think that I mattered, and that I couldn't do anything. And I'll never forget when my dad died Robert Kennedy Jr. came and spent 2 days with me, and then he invited me to his home in Bedford, New York, and we were walking through the woods with his hawks, and he was telling me how I needed to do my part, and I said, oh, I'm just an actress. I don't really matter in all of this. He said, but you do, Donzaleigh, but you do. And then I left, Bobby, and I kept thinking about it, and then I thought, well, I must do something. So then I started working with people who had HIV and AIDS. And when I was serving, all of a sudden I felt more whole inside. I was giving. And when the Los Angeles Riots happened and Los Angeles was burning, I went to the midst of the chaos and took a broom and started sweeping the streets of Los Angeles and got on a line and started just, you know, we would relay the bags of grocery. And then I went into Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs delivering the food with white men. And I was a lone black woman in this truck, and they were like, you're gonna get killed. And I said, you know what? It's all right. It's better that my life be about something and I die serving humanity than if I live in fear on the west side of LA. So I'm gonna do my part. I don't know how long I have, but I want someone to know, just like with my dad and Uncle Martin, that we came this way and that we stood for something and that we tried to make the world a better place.
What a testament to your father. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
When we come back, what role does the media play in shaping the public discourse on race? We'll ask our panel next.